The 40th floor lobby of Falcone Holdings was never a loud place, but that morning it fell utterly silent when the thin silver chain, mended with a cheap iron ring, snapped from the neck of a secretary who was balancing a stack of files and leaning aside to let a cart pass, and something small and brass fell, bounced twice on the marble, slid across the polished floor, and came to rest against the black leather shoe of the most powerful man in Meridian Bay. The impact freed a catch that had been jammed shut for years, and into that hushed lobby a melody rose, thin, warped, stumbling out of rhythm with time, the sound of a music box that had turned more revolutions than anyone could count in a single lifetime. No one dared bend down to pick it up. No one dared breathe, because Gideon Falcone stood frozen in the middle of that lobby, and in all his years at the head of the family, no one had ever seen that particular expression on his face. He knew this song. He had heard it on sleepless nights when he was 7 years old, when his mother sat on the edge of his bed, her cold hand smoothing his hair, humming that exact melody in the rough voice of a woman who had just finished crying and did not want her son to know. He had heard it for the last time in a room heavy with the smell of medicine, when that hand let go of his and never closed around it again. The song had no name, it existed on no record, and he had sent men searching for it through many winters, without a single one of them finding it. And yet it was pouring out of a brass box lying at his feet, a box belonging to a young woman whose name he had never bothered to remember. Gideon Falcone bent down. The entire lobby held its breath, because this was a man who bowed to nothing, not to the police, not to rival families, not even to his own father's casket. And yet here he was, kneeling on one knee against the stone floor, lifting the box with hands that had once made an entire city look away. The brass cylinder inside was still turning slowly, scraping out its final notes before it died, and he realized the melody had stopped halfway, like a sentence left unfinished. Then he saw it. The fall had cracked and lifted the felt lining in the bottom of the box, revealing a yellowed black and white photograph, its four corners split with age. In it, a young woman stood before the gate of a stone church, cradling a newborn wrapped in a blanket. And she was not smiling, but glancing back over her shoulder, as though afraid someone might see her. Gideon recognized her instantly. It was his mother. But the photograph had been taken before she ever set foot inside the Falcone family, before her marriage, before he was born, and the child in her arms was not him. In that moment, the man who ruled the entire harbor district of Meridian Bay understood that the woman he had loved most in the world had carried a secret to her grave, and that the trembling secretary standing 3 steps away had worn a piece of that secret around her neck her whole life without ever knowing it. 3 generations, a promise no one ever spoke aloud, and a debt the two of them were about to repay together. If you believe that kindness planted in silence never truly disappears, please leave a like, a comment, share this story, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this journey with us. Gideon Falcone rose slowly, the bronze box still resting neatly in the palm of his hand. He didn't give it back. The entire lobby remained trapped in that same thick, suffocating silence. The silence of people who knew they had just witnessed something they were never supposed to see, and that it would be best if none of them remembered being there at all. He looked at the young woman standing 3 steps away from him, the stack of files still clutched tightly against her chest like a useless shield, several strands of hair fallen loose from her low bun, and nothing left around her neck but the thin red mark where the chain had just been torn away. "What's your name?" He didn't ask the question. He spoke the words in a low, even voice without the slightest rise or fall. The kind of voice everyone who worked in this building had learned to fear long ago. "Adeline Mercer, sir," she answered, and heard her own voice break on the final syllable. "I work in administration on the 22nd floor. This morning, I was assigned to come up here in place of Miss Dunbar, who's out sick, to deliver the shipping manifest files." She added details no one had asked for, because there was only one thought left in her mind now, that she had done something terribly wrong, that they were about to fire her, that next month she wouldn't have enough money to pay what remained. Around them, the people waiting for the elevators watched her the way people watched someone who had just been caught in the act. No one showed pity. There was only cold curiosity, and a quiet trace of gratitude that they weren't the one standing in her place. Emmett Vaughn stepped forward and lightly touched Gideon's elbow, lowering his voice until only the two of them could hear. "The Halloran people have been waiting in the conference room for a while." Gideon turned his head. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at Emmett for a single moment, and the silver-haired man who had served this family since Gideon's father still occupied that chair immediately stepped back half a pace, nodded, and fell silent. No one in the lobby understood what had just happened, but every one of them understood that the meeting had just been brushed aside as easily as a scrap of paper swept from a desk. "Bring her upstairs," Gideon said, then walked directly toward the private elevator, and the crowd parted into two lines before him, without anyone giving the order. Adeline followed, her legs heavy as lead, the files still pressed against her chest because she didn't know where else to put them, and she could hear the sound of her own heels striking the stone floor, too loud, too distinct, inside a lobby where everyone was still holding their breath. The elevator doors closed. There was no panel of floor numbers inside, only a key card that Gideon passed over the reader before the car began to rise. 4 walls of brushed steel reflected the dim shapes of 2 people. A tall man in a dark suit standing as straight as a pillar, a small young woman pressed into the corner, and between them, a distance of less than an arm's length that somehow felt as long as an entire lifetime. Neither of them spoke. Adeline didn't dare look up at his face. Her eyes remained fixed on his left hand, where the tiny bronze box lay motionless, its lid still slightly open, its edges worn smooth from so many years of resting against another person's skin. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. She had worn it through nights spent working the second shift, through mornings when she opened the refrigerator and silently calculated how many days the food inside would last, through the day she sat in a hospital corridor and listened as someone read out the final number. She had never been able to open it, and now it rested in the hand of a stranger, while she stood there without even the right to reach out and ask for it back. The elevator continued upward, slow and silent. And in that silence, Adeline suddenly realized something that sent a cold chill down her spine. This man wasn't angry. He was gripping the box tightly, so tightly, as though he was afraid it might disappear. The elevator doors opened onto a corridor carpeted in charcoal gray, and Gideon walked straight into his office without looking back. A young man in a gray suit pointed toward a row of leather chairs set against the glass wall, signaling for Adeline to sit, then remained standing behind her like a courteous shadow. She placed the stack of files on her lap, rested both hands over it, and from where she sat, she could see the entire room beyond the bare glass partition. She saw Gideon remove his jacket and drape it over the back of his chair. She saw Emmett Vaughn hand him a thin folder. Then she saw the dark wooden door on the other side open, allowing a man with salt and pepper hair to step inside. He looked to be around 60. The collar of his wool coat was worn, and he held a knitted cap crushed tightly in one hand. From the way he walked, Adeline knew at once that he was afraid. Gideon didn't rise, but he gestured toward the chair across from him with something almost resembling hospitality. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquor from the crystal decanter on the low cabinet, pushed one toward the man, then settled back with the ease of someone who had the entire morning to spare. Through the glass, Adeline couldn't make out every word. She could only hear the rhythm of their voices, and what made her skin prickle was how warm Gideon sounded. He was asking about something, nodding, and even the corner of his mouth lifted slightly as the other man stammered through his answer. Adeline guessed he was talking about his daughter's wedding, because his hand finally released the knitted cap and began tracing the shape of something in the air, perhaps the dress, perhaps the reception hall. Gideon listened with careful attention. He asked another question. The man answered, and Gideon raised his glass as though offering a toast. Then he set it down on the desk and spoke a single sentence. Adeline watched it happen as clearly as she might have watched a candle being blown out. The man's face changed color from the inside out. His mouth remained frozen in the shape of a smile, but his eyes went empty, and he nodded, quickly, repeatedly, without stopping. He rose and offered his hand. Gideon shook it with perfect courtesy. When the man stepped out through the dark wooden door and past the chair where Adeline sat, she saw that both his hands were trembling violently, trembling so badly that the knitted cap slipped from his fingers and fell onto the carpet without him even noticing. Throughout the entire meeting, no one had touched him, and no voice had risen above the level of ordinary conversation. Adeline bent down and picked up the cap, meaning to call after him, but the man had already disappeared into the elevator. She sat back down with the knitted cap in her hands, and for the first time in the 3 months she had worked in this building, she understood that she had never truly known who she worked for. The dark wooden door opened again. This time, a broad-shouldered man with his collar hanging open walked in with the swagger of someone returning home with good news. He delivered his report quickly and enthusiastically, his hands cutting through the air, and through the narrow opening, Adeline caught only scattered fragments. Something about a flower shop, something about the wife, something about the other side understanding the message immediately. Gideon didn't interrupt. He allowed the man to finish every word and let the final laugh leave his mouth before rising from his chair, walking around the desk, and stopping directly in front of him. Adeline couldn't hear the question Gideon asked. She only saw the smile disappear from the man's face. Emmett Vaughn closed the notebook in his hand with the softest motion. Gideon spoke one more short sentence, then extended his hand, palm facing upward. The man stood rooted to the floor, opened his mouth as though to explain, while Gideon kept his hand exactly where it was, motionless, without repeating himself. At last, the man reached inside his coat, pulled out a key and a small card, and placed them in Gideon's palm. Gideon closed his fingers around them. Then he spoke one final time, and this time his voice was loud enough to carry through the gap in the door and down to the row of chairs where Adeline sat. They were the first words she had heard clearly from that man all day. He said that in this house, no one was permitted to touch anyone's wife or children, not even the wife or children of the man they intended to crush, and anyone who couldn't understand that no longer belonged there. Two men in suits entered and took their places on either side of the broad-shouldered man. He walked out with a face gone white and never looked back. Inside the room beyond the glass, Gideon turned toward the window and stood there for a long time, staring down at the harbor veiled in fog. Emmett Vaughn didn't ask why that was the one rule Gideon would never bend, because so many winters had passed that even Gideon himself had never asked the question. Then he turned around, looked through the glass, and his gaze came to rest precisely where Adeline sat, holding a stranger's knitted cap in her hands. The man in the gray suit opened the door and motioned for Adeline to step inside, and she crossed the threshold of that dark wooden doorway with the stranger's knitted cap still in her hands. She didn't know where to put it, so in the end she set it on top of the stack of files in her lap. When she sat down in the chair, the salt and pepper-haired man had just vacated, a chair that hadn't even had time to cool. On the wide glass desk, alone in the middle of a polished emptiness so clear it reflected the ceiling above, the little bronze box lay with its lid still slightly open, and it looked almost pitifully small inside that room. Gideon sat down across from her, laced his fingers together, and asked so quietly that the question seemed to fall between them. Where had she gotten it? Adeline drew in a breath. She had practiced lying many times in her life. She had lied to the landlord and said the money would come next week. She had lied to her younger sister and said she wasn't hungry. But sitting in front of this man, she understood at once that every carefully chosen word would be useless, so she told him the truth. It had belonged to her mother. She had kept it since before Adeline was born, hidden in a drawer with the important papers, and only when her illness grew worse had she threaded it onto a chain and placed it around her daughter's neck with her own hands. The lid was jammed shut. It had been stuck for a very long time, so long that once Adeline had taken it to a watch repair shop on the street and asked if it could be opened. The old repairman had shaken his head and told her he would have to pry the hinge apart and ruin it, and if he ruined it, what would be left? So she let it be. She had never seen what was inside it, not once in her entire life. She hadn't even known it was a music box until that morning. Gideon didn't ask another question. He simply sat there in silence, and the silence stretched on so long that Adeline felt compelled to keep speaking just to fill it. And so she told him something she had never told anyone, not even the only friend who still kept in touch. On her mother's final night in the hospital, she had taken hold of Adeline's wrist and squeezed it tightly with the little strength she had left. She told her never to sell the box, no matter how desperate things became, no matter if she had to sell everything else in the house, because one day it would repay a debt her mother hadn't lived long enough to settle. Adeline paused, then added in a quieter voice that she had asked her mother who the debt was owed to and how much it was. But her mother had only shaken her head and said that some debts weren't measured in money, and those were the last words she ever spoke about it. Adeline fell silent. The morning light stretched across the glass desk, dividing the distance between them in two, and the bronze box lay directly on that line. Gideon looked at it for a long time. Adeline had already prepared every sentence she thought she might need. She was ready to resign. She was sorry for causing trouble. She understood if he needed to keep it for inspection. And she had already warned herself that she wasn't allowed to cry in front of this man. Then Gideon reached out, and she stopped breathing. With a slow, almost careful motion, he closed the lid of the box, then slid it across the glass toward her. Adeline didn't understand. She looked at the box, then up at his face, then back at the box again, and she remained perfectly still, because there was no response in her mind prepared for this. Behind her, Emmett Vaughn paused in the doorway for the space of a single heartbeat, and he was the only person in the entire building who understood that he had just witnessed something that had never happened before, because in all the years he had stood behind that man, he had never once seen Gideon Falcone return anything he had taken into his hand. "It belongs to you," Gideon said, and there wasn't a trace of warmth in his voice, only the finality of a man who had just made a decision within himself. Then he told her that starting today, she wouldn't be returning to the 22nd floor, that she would work directly under him beginning the next morning, and he didn't ask whether she agreed. Adeline picked up the box and pressed it into her palm. It was still warm from his hand, and she realized that something had just been returned to her, while something else had been taken away, something she didn't yet know how to name. The train carried Adeline home to the north side after night had already fallen, and when she opened the door to the third-floor apartment, the smell of boiling water had drifted all the way into the hallway. The apartment had only one bedroom and a kitchen, so narrow that opening the refrigerator door made it touch the dining table, and that table was really an old-school desk with 2 plastic chairs pulled up beside it. But tonight, June had covered it with a red and white checkered cloth she had found somewhere, and in the center sat a glass cup holding 3 leafy stems cut from the potted plant on the balcony. The 7-year-old stood on a chair with her hair tied crookedly to one side, carefully arranging 2 plates so they sat perfectly even, and when she saw her sister come in, she cried out that Adeline was 5 minutes late, but the restaurant had saved her table. June held out a sheet of paper drawn with colored pencils, bordered with flowers and stars, and in the middle, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Mercer Restaurant, tonight's menu." Beneath that, she had listed the chef's special as Mercer-style noodles, the featured drink as filtered water with 1 slice of lemon, and dessert as a secret. Adeline sat down on the plastic chair, picked up the menu, and studied it with complete seriousness, before asking what made tonight's special different from yesterday's special. In the voice of a professional server, June explained that today the chef had added fried onions, and that it was a family secret she wasn't permitted to reveal. The 2 sisters laughed, and their laughter sounded very loud inside that narrow kitchen, carrying all the way through the wall beside them. The noodles were ladled into 2 mismatched bowls, and June sprinkled the fried onions with both hands as though she were scattering something precious, then solemnly announced that the restaurant was ready to serve its guests. As they ate, the little girl told her that the teacher had posted the list on the board, and June's name was on the 4th line, that the summer art camp would last 3 weeks in the forest to the north, where there was a lake and wooden cabins, and every child would be given a paint box of their own, that they wouldn't have to share with anyone. June said her friend Marlowe had told her that at night they would sit around a fire and sing, that she planned to paint a picture so large they could hang it in the kitchen, and that Adeline absolutely had to come to the final camp exhibition, because the picture would have her in it too. Adeline listened and nodded, passing her sister a napkin, and for one very brief moment, her eyes moved toward the drawer beneath the sink, where that morning she had hidden an envelope with bold lettering in the upper corner and the seal of the hospital billing office. It was the 3rd envelope in 2 months, and each one had come with another line of smaller print added near the bottom of the page. She stood, pretended she needed more water, and pushed the envelope to the very back of the drawer beneath the dish towels and several old container lids, then closed it with her hip. By the time she returned to the table, she was smiling, and she told June that she promised she would be there, that she would ask for half a day off and stand in the very front row so she could see everything clearly. June held up her little finger. Adeline hooked her own around it, and the girl declared that the promise had now been officially sealed and couldn't be taken back. Then June asked where the secret dessert was, and Adeline reached into her handbag and took out a cookie wrapped in foil that she had brought home from the tray in the employee break room. She broke it carefully in half in front of her sister, and they both ate their portions very slowly. That night, after June had fallen asleep, Adeline sat on the edge of the bed, took the bronze box from beneath the collar of her blouse, and turned it over in her hands under the kitchen light. The lid had closed again, sealed as tightly as before. She thought about the man on the 40th floor and how firmly he had gripped that box, and for the first time in her life, she wondered who her mother had once known. That same night, nearly an hour's drive from the north side, Gideon Falcone stopped before a door at the end of the 2nd floor hallway in the old house on the cliff, a door he had passed more times than he could count, but had never opened since the day they carried the coffin down the steps outside. Emmett Vaughn stood behind him with a ring of keys in his hand and said nothing. He simply waited, and at last Gideon reached back, took the keys from him, and told him to go downstairs. The lock was so stiff that he had to turn the key twice, and when the door opened, the first things that reached him were the smell of dry dust and the faint scent of cedar rising from beneath the draped cloths. The room remained exactly as it had been on the final night. White sheets covered the furniture like a gathering of people standing silently in wait, and an olive-green safe rested in the corner beneath the window, coated in a fine layer of dust. Gideon knelt before it. He turned the dial to the date his mother had always written in the corner of every card she ever sent, and the safe door sprang open with a dry click. There was no money inside, no jewelry, no property papers. There were only 3 things. The first was a brown leather notebook. Its spine faded with age, and when he opened it, he found every page crowded with handwritten lines that weren't letters or numbers, but tiny symbols shaped like hooks and semicolons layered over one another, broken here and there by groups of 3 or 4 strokes that he couldn't read as a single character. He flipped through it quickly. 20 pages, 50 pages, the entire thick book from beginning to end, and there wasn't one word of English anywhere, except for a few abbreviated names written in the margins. The second was a black and white photograph torn in half, with only the right side remaining. On that half was the gray stone wall of a building, a stretch of steps, and along the torn edge, a fragment of a clothed shoulder and a hand wrapped around something that could no longer be seen. He placed it on the floor very slowly and didn't pick it up again. The third object lay at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of wine-colored velvet. Gideon unfolded the cloth and sat perfectly still. It was a small bronze box, the same size, with the same kind of hinge, and the same engraved branches and leaves across the lid, so identical that if it were placed beside the box he had returned to the young woman that morning, no one would have been able to tell which belonged to whom. The only difference was that the bronze surface of this one still shone more brightly, because it had never rested against anyone's skin for an entire lifetime. He turned it over. There was a narrow slot for a winding key, and the tiny bronze key was still fitted into place. Gideon turned it. Once, twice, 3 times, until the spring drew tight, and the key would turn no farther. Then he opened the lid. The melody sprang to life inside the sealed room, and within the first 3 notes he shot to his feet, because this song didn't begin where it was supposed to begin. It began at the exact point where the other box had stopped that morning, the place he had believed the melody had broken because the spring had worn out. It continued. It moved through the long, lingering passage where his mother had always lowered her voice whenever she sang it, passed through the final 3 notes as they descended one by one, and came to a complete ending, exactly as he had heard it through all those nights when he was 7 years old. Then it fell silent. Gideon stood in the middle of the room draped in white cloth, still holding the box as it trembled faintly in his hand, and he understood that for all these years, what he had kept inside the safe in his own home had been only the second half of a story, while the first half was hanging around the neck of a young woman who worked on the 22nd floor, a woman whose name he had never heard anyone speak until that morning. The following morning, Adeline wasn't taken to the 40th floor. Instead, she was led down to the 2nd basement level, a place she hadn't even known existed during the 3 months she had worked in the building. Emmett Vaughn swiped his card to open a steel door, switched on the long row of fluorescent lights running across the ceiling, and before her stretched a room that seemed to disappear into the distance, filled with rows of metal shelves taller than a person. Hundreds of cardboard boxes, their surfaces faded to the color of old tea, were stacked along them, each one bearing a handwritten paper label that had blurred with age. He handed her a stack of blank forms, a handheld scanner, and a marker, then told her that her task was to open each box and record the type of documents inside, the period they covered, and the condition of the papers. She wasn't permitted to remove anything from the room. She wasn't allowed to make copies. Someone would come down every 2 hours to check on her. Adeline asked what the boss wanted her to find in all of this. Emmett looked at her for a moment, then replied that the boss hadn't said what he wanted to find, and in this house, that was perfectly normal. He went back upstairs. The steel door closed behind him, and Adeline was left alone with the steady hum of the fluorescent lights. She worked throughout the morning. The first box contained warehouse rental agreements. The second held payroll records for dock workers. The third contained fuel receipts for ships. All of it was the dry, ordinary paperwork of an ordinary transportation company, and she recorded everything methodically, her fingers turning black with paper dust. At one point, she stopped, lowered herself onto the cold concrete floor, opened the lunch container she had brought, and ate quickly, while the same question repeated itself over and over in her mind. Why had that man returned the bronze box to her instead of keeping it? By early afternoon, she had reached the fourth row of shelves, where the boxes looked noticeably older, their paper labels peeling at the edges, and the handwriting unlike that of any archivist whose work she had seen in the previous rows. She pulled out the box numbered 7 from a shelf at eye level, brushed the dust from its lid, and reached for the brittle strip of tape. Then she froze. In the upper right corner of the paper label, beside the number 7 written in blue ink, was a tiny cluster of symbols, 3 hooked strokes layered over one another, with a slash cutting across beneath them. Adeline stood motionless between the shelves, and for a moment the basement vanished from around her. In its place came the old kitchen from the apartment where she had lived as a child, the green-covered shopping ledger her mother always kept face down on top of the refrigerator, its pages crowded with these exact symbols, which Adeline had once spent hours trying to copy. She heard her mother's voice telling her that it was the writing used by women long ago, meant only for one another to read, and that there was no reason for a child to waste time learning it. But Adeline had learned. She still remembered more than 30 of the symbols, and the cluster on that label was one of them, the very first one her mother had taught her. It meant, keep this secret. Adeline's hand remained on the lid of the box, and she stood that way for a long time, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked up at the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Its red indicator light was glowing. She drew her hand back, pushed the box deep into the shelf exactly where it had been, and wrote a harmless entry on the form stating that Box 7 contained unsorted shipping records. Then she moved on to Box 8, and continued working as though nothing had happened. By the end of the day, when she signed the entry log and climbed up from the basement, she had decided that the first thing she would do the next morning was ask to speak with the boss. But that night, before she had even managed to fall asleep, the fire alarm inside the Falcone Holdings building began to shriek. The call came while Adeline was sitting on the edge of the bed with her phone lying face down beside her. The voice of the human resources operator trembled through the line, saying there was a fire in the basement archive, that every employee whose name appeared in that day's entry log had to confirm their location, and Adeline only managed to say, "I'm fine. I'm at home," before ending the call and sitting perfectly still for exactly 3 breaths. June was asleep in the bedroom, the door left slightly open, her breathing soft and even. Adeline pulled on her coat, went downstairs, knocked on the door of the apartment across the hall, and asked Mrs. Hollis to watch her sister for a little while, then ran toward the night train station. By the time she arrived, an entire section of the street was crowded with fire engines, red and blue lights sweeping across the glass face of the building in blurred streaks, while barriers were being raised across the entrance. Adeline slipped through the crowd of night shift employees gathered on the sidewalk, held up her identification card to the guard at the side entrance, and said she was the one cataloging the files below, that she needed to retrieve the forms, speaking so quickly that even she barely heard herself lie. The stairwell leading down to the second basement level was filled with smoke along its lower half, thick gray smoke crawling beneath the ceiling before curling downward, while the main lighting system had gone dark, leaving only the emergency lights mounted along the base of the walls, flashing in waves of cold white. Adeline pulled her collar over her nose and mouth and went down. The air below was hot and dry, burning the inside of her throat, and the fire didn't roar the way she had imagined it would. Instead, it made a steady rushing sound from the far end of the room, near the 7th and 8th rows of shelves. She bent low, moved along the wall, and counted each row with her hand. The first row, the second row. At the third row, a metal shelf had collapsed across the passage, cardboard boxes scattered everywhere, and she had to crawl through the narrow gap beneath one of the steel bars to reach the other side. The fourth row. The emergency light flashed once and went dark, then flickered back on, and in that brief pulse of light, she saw box number 7 still resting on the shelf at eye level, the edge of its paper label already curling from the heat. Adeline reached out and pulled it free. The box was heavier than she expected. The lid sprang open, and papers began sliding out, so she wrapped both arms around it, pressed it against her stomach, and started backing away. Behind her, a sharp crack sounded as the hinge of another metal shelf finally gave way beneath the heat, and the entire row leaned sideways before crashing into the one beside it, sending a long metallic collision rolling through the length of the room. Adeline dropped to one knee. The box slipped from her hands. She reached blindly through the smoke, caught hold of its edge, dragged it across the concrete floor, and kept dragging it through the gap beneath the steel bar, past the second row, past the first, until her hand finally touched the first step of the staircase. Then someone seized her wrist. The hand was large, dry, and gripped her so tightly that she cried out, and she was pulled violently up from the steps, dragged backward up the stairwell, her feet missing several steps before they found the rhythm to follow. She still held the box tightly against her with her other arm. When they reached the side lobby, the night air struck her face with a freezing rush, and Adeline doubled over coughing, the box falling onto the tiled floor between them. Gideon Falcone stood in front of her with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his tie removed, and there was no worry on his face, only something far more intense. He asked whether she understood what she had just done. Before she could answer, he continued, his voice never rising, yet every word falling like stone. There was a room burning beneath them, and she had gone back inside. She had just traded her life for a stack of papers when she didn't even know what they contained. Adeline straightened. Her hair clung damply to her forehead. Her sleeves were streaked with grime, and for the first time since they had met, she looked directly into the man's eyes. She said she had spent her entire life living under the power of stacks of paper like that. That some papers decided whether she still had a home to return to, some papers decided which hospital room her mother was placed in, and that when people had nothing left, documents were the only proof that they had ever existed. Then she asked him, her voice raw from the smoke, "And you, what do you have to lose?" Gideon didn't answer. He stood there amid the wail of the fire engines and the flashing light sweeping across the walls, looking at the small young woman trembling from the cold and from something that wasn't fear, and for the first time in many winters, the man couldn't find a single word to say. 3 days after the fire, Adeline was summoned to the 40th floor after the building had emptied for the night. There were 4 men in Gideon's office whom she had never seen before. One had brought a magnifying glass and a set of inspection lamps. Another had spread enlarged prints of every page across the desk, and resting on the glass surface was a brown leather-bound notebook she had never seen. They had been sitting there for 2 days. The man with the magnifying glass said it wasn't a substitution cipher, it wasn't a transposition cipher, and it didn't correspond to any system of commercial shorthand ever known to have circulated. He was inclined to believe it was a private system of symbols created by one individual, which meant that if the person who invented it was dead, no one would ever be able to decipher it. The man beside him nodded and added that they could attempt a statistical frequency analysis, but with only a few dozen pages of material, the results wouldn't be reliable. Gideon stood with his back to them, looking down over the harbor, and he hadn't called Adeline in to ask for her opinion. He had called her to sign the revised archive inventory after the fire. She took the forms, walked past the desk, and her eyes passed over one enlarged print lying near the edge. She stopped. She set the forms down, leaned closer, and all 4 men in the room looked up at her with the irritation of experts being disturbed by a secretary. Adeline didn't notice. She traced a finger along the first line of symbols, her lips moving silently, then said something that brought the entire room to a standstill. "This isn't a code." The man with the magnifying glass asked her to repeat herself in a voice that was almost laughing. Adeline said it was an old form of shorthand used by women, the kind they taught one another when recording market expenses, borrowed money, and things they didn't want their husbands to read if someone happened to open the wrong drawer. Every region and every household changed it slightly, so it had never been written down in any book, and it was passed only to daughters, taught by word of mouth, while women cooked beside them. She said her mother had begun teaching it to her before she could even read printed words properly. Gideon turned around. He told the 4 men to leave. No one objected. When the dark wooden door closed and only the 2 of them remained, he pushed the notebook toward her and pulled out a chair. Adeline sat down, opened to the first page, and began reading aloud, slowly, sometimes stopping for a long while because there were symbols she had to interpret from the context around them. Line after line emerged. A woman's name shortened into 2 strokes, a point in time recorded by season instead of by number. A sum of money, an address reduced to 3 symbols indicating direction, the type of residence, and the person to contact. Then another name, another sum of money, another address. Page after page, hundreds of names followed one another. Some appeared only once, others appeared 5 or 6 times across many seasons. accompanied by brief notes that Adeline translated into scattered sentences, such as, "Arrived safely, found work, the child has started school, no more money needed." She read through nearly the entire notebook, her voice growing hoarse, and during all that time Gideon didn't sit down once. He stood on the other side of the desk with both hands braced against the glass, his head bowed over every page as though, if he stared long enough, the symbols might reveal something meant for him alone. When Adeline reached the final page, she stopped. She turned it back and forth twice. Then she said that this line was different. Gideon came around the desk, stopped close beside her, and looked down. At the bottom of the final page, separated from the writing above by a wide stretch of blank space, there was one additional line of symbols. Its ink was darker, newer, untouched by the fading that marked everything else in the notebook. The strokes were uneven and unsteady, pressed so hard in places that they had slightly torn the paper, like the handwriting of someone trying to imitate another person and failing. Adeline ran her finger over the line and said she could translate the name, but whoever had written this line wasn't the person who had written the rest of the notebook. Gideon didn't ask how she knew. He simply stood there, very close, and when he turned to look at her, there was nothing left in his eyes of the man who had dragged her out of the stairwell on the night of the fire. It was the look one gave to someone who had just opened a door they had spent years standing before, knocking. The following morning, Gideon drove himself, and Adeline sat in the passenger seat, with the torn half of the photograph resting on her lap, comparing every detail of the stone wall against the churches she had found. They traveled north, leaving the harbor behind, passing rows of low warehouses that gradually thinned and then disappeared entirely, until the paved road gave way to gravel climbing a gentle slope. The church stood at the end of that road, a low, square structure built of gray stone, its tiled roof bleached pale by years of rain and wind, its bell tower no taller than the elm tree growing beside it. 3 stone steps led to the entrance, worn hollow in the middle by countless feet. Adeline stepped out of the car, raised the half photograph to eye level, and lowered her hand very slowly, because the outline of the wall in the picture matched the wall before them exactly, except that the elm tree had been much smaller then. Inside, the church was empty and cold. Morning light passed through the only stained glass window still intact, and cast a band of blue and gold across the tiled floor. An elderly priest was dusting the front pew, his back bent and his hands trembling, and he looked up when he heard their footsteps. Adeline spoke first, explaining that they had come to ask about a photograph taken outside this church many years ago. He didn't look at the photograph. His eyes stopped on the bronze box hanging around her neck, its lid visible above the collar of her blouse, and his entire body went rigid. He set the cloth down on the pew, came closer, and asked in a hoarse voice whether she had brought the other one. Gideon took the second box from the pocket of his coat and placed it on the armrest of the pew. The priest looked at the 2 boxes, then dropped heavily onto the seat, his hands resting on his knees, and remained silent for a long time before saying that he had waited for this day so long that he had stopped believing it would ever come. He led them down into the church basement by a narrow stone staircase behind the pulpit, opened a wooden door, and in the corner of the cellar, beneath a canvas sheet draped over a stack of broken chairs, sat a square iron box painted military green, the edges of its lid still sealed with wax that had darkened to brown. He said the woman had brought it there during the last winter when she was still able to walk, and she had given him only one instruction. He wasn't to give it to anyone, not to her husband, not to her son, not even to someone who came with lawful papers demanding it. He was to surrender it only when a person carrying the other half appeared at the door of this church. Gideon asked whether she had explained why they had to wait until then. The priest shook his head and said she had only told him that if the 2 halves had not yet found each other, then the time had not come, and everyone would misunderstand the entire story. He placed the iron box on the front pew but didn't open it, then told them to do what she had always imagined would happen here. Adeline removed the chain from her neck. The 2 bronze boxes were placed side by side on the wooden surface. The 2 tiny keys were turned until both springs were fully wound, and both lids were opened at the same time. The melody began, the first half from one box flowing into the second half from the other without missing a single beat. And inside that empty stone church, the song played in full for the first time, moving through the long, lingering passage before descending into its final 3 notes, and fading into the echo still suspended beneath the vaulted ceiling. No one spoke. Adeline stood motionless because she had never heard any sound come from the object she had worn for so many years. Gideon stood like a man, hearing the voice of someone long dead. Then the elderly priest spoke, so quietly that the words nearly disappeared, and said that the song hadn't belonged to Rosalind. Gideon turned toward him. The old man looked down at his hands and explained that during that winter, a mother and child had hidden in the very basement they had just visited. A young mother and a newborn baby. They remained there for many weeks, with the cellar door locked from the outside. And every night he heard a lullaby rising through the wooden floor, a song he had never heard anywhere else. The young mother said it had belonged to her own mother, that it was sung only within the family, and that no one outside their bloodline knew it. Then he said that Rosalind had spent the final nights down there with the mother and child before helping them escape, and she had learned the song by heart from that young woman. Gideon stood in the band of blue and golden light falling from the stained glass window. All his life, the gentlest thing he had managed to keep, the only sound that had ever made him believe there had once been some honest and decent part of his past, hadn't belonged to his mother at all. She had borrowed it from a woman hiding in darkness because of his family, and that woman was the grandmother of the young woman standing within an arm's reach of him. On the drive back, the iron box painted military green rested on the back seat, its wax seal still intact because Gideon had said they shouldn't open it yet, while Adeline kept the leather-bound notebook on her lap. She turned back to the beginning, not because she meant to continue reading, but because there was one place she had deliberately avoided for the past several days. The first page contained only a single line placed in the center of the blank paper, shorter than every other line in the book, underlined twice with strokes pressed so hard that they had left impressions on the reverse side. In the office on the 40th floor, she had skimmed over it and assumed it was a title, some kind of name for the ledger. Now, sitting in the car with the afternoon light falling sideways across the page, she looked more closely and realized that the cluster of symbols at the end of the line wasn't a period, but a marker for a person, the same symbol her mother had always placed before the names of relatives in her household accounts. Adeline told Gideon to pull over. He didn't ask why. He simply steered into an empty turnout beside the road and switched off the engine. She placed the notebook on the dashboard, pointed to each stroke one by one, and explained slowly that the first 3 symbols formed an abbreviated woman's name, that the next cluster wasn't an amount of money, but a symbol indicating purpose, the kind her mother had used in her market ledger to mark funds set aside and not to be spent on anything else. She paused. Then, she said the final cluster meant leave. She read the entire line aloud, and the abbreviated name at the beginning was Rosalind Falcone. The car remained silent for a very long time. Adeline turned to the second page, then the third, and now that she knew what she was looking for, everything appeared entirely different, because the opening entries didn't record anyone else's name. They listed small amounts of money being separated little by little. The name of a town to the west, a false name made up of 2 short words, and even one line meaning the papers were finished. Every entry had been preparation for one person, and that person was Rosalind herself. Adeline said very quietly that Rosalind had created this fund so she could leave. She kept turning the pages, and around the 9th page, that thread of entries ended completely. There was no explanation, not one line saying why. From the following page onward, the abbreviated name at the beginning of each entry was no longer Rosalind's, but someone else's, one woman after another, while the symbol marking the purpose remained unchanged. It was still money set aside, not to be spent on anything else. The funds continued to flow year after year, passing into the hands of one person and then another, while the name underlined twice on the first page never appeared again. Gideon remained silent behind the wheel. He didn't ask her to repeat herself, didn't tell her to read it again, and didn't take out his phone to call anyone. He simply reached over, drew the notebook toward himself, opened it again to the first page, and sat staring at that short line underlined twice. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken. The streetlights along the road leading into the harbor came on one by one, and their yellow glow passed across his face in waves whenever another car drove by. Adeline said nothing more. She knew she was sitting beside a man who had just been forced to rearrange every memory he possessed into a different order. All his life, Gideon Falcone had believed his mother was a woman who endured in silence, a beautiful and quiet woman married into that house, seated at the head of the dining table without ever offering an opinion, lowering her gaze whenever his father raised his voice. Her entire life reduced to a succession of afternoons spent beside a window looking out at the sea. He had grown up carrying that pity, and had turned it into one of the reasons he believed kindness and weakness were the same thing. Now, in a car parked at the side of the road, He held proof that the silent woman had once drawn her own escape route with her own hand, had saved a little at a time through season after season, had completed every document, and had stood directly before that open door only to turn away from it, using everything she had gathered for her own freedom, to purchase freedom for women she didn't even know. Gideon closed the notebook very gently, placed it on his lap, and remained there in the darkness for a long time without starting the engine. For an entire week, everyone in the building whispered that the fire had been a message from Sterling Marsh, that the men from the North Harbor wanted to test how quickly the Falcone family could still respond, and Emmett Vaughn leaned toward the same theory when he placed the security team's preliminary report on Gideon's desk. Gideon read it and pushed it aside. He told Emmett to call the man responsible for the camera system, not to ask about the night of the fire, but about the 2 weeks before it, and during the next 3 days, he never mentioned the fire again. He simply requested statements from the 4 intermediary accounts the company still used to move cash through the docks. By Wednesday afternoon, he had enough. The person who had used a keycard to open the archive basement on the night before the fire wasn't one of Sterling's men. It was Boyd Kessler, the finance manager, the man who had occupied an office in the accounting department on the 36th floor since Gideon's father was still alive, the man who sent greeting cards every holiday and still remembered that Gideon drank his coffee without sugar. The statements showed that, season after season, a small amount had been shaved from every shipment passing through the South Harbor, too little for anyone to notice when looking at a single load, but when added together, it became enough to buy a house by a lake and support a second life no one in this building knew existed. And all the original documents for those shipments were stored in the 7th and 8th rows of the archive basement. Boyd Kessler entered the office on the 40th floor late that afternoon, carrying a leather briefcase, and halfway through a casual remark about the weather, Gideon invited him to sit. He didn't produce the bank statements. He didn't show him the camera footage. He didn't say a single word about the fire. He merely opened a drawer, took out an ivory-colored envelope, and slid it across the glass desk. Boyd looked at the envelope, then at Gideon, then opened it. Inside was a passport bearing his name, but not the one he normally used, a one-way plane ticket heading southwest, and a sheet of paper listing the name of a bank there, along with a figure large enough for a middle-aged man to live out the rest of his life without ever needing to work again. Boyd's hand began to tremble. He set the envelope down and opened his mouth, but Gideon raised one finger, only one, and Boyd fell silent. Then Gideon spoke in the same even voice he had used when asking a shipowner about his daughter's wedding. He said he didn't need to hear an explanation, because he had already read everything, that the flight would leave the morning after next, and his men would take Boyd to the airport, that his family would be sent to join him afterward, and that no one would touch his wife or his children, because that was a matter for Gideon's house to decide, not Boyd's. Boyd sat without moving. Gideon gave him one final warning. In this house, a traitor was allowed to leave only once, and if Boyd was still in the city after the day following tomorrow, the person who came looking for him wouldn't be Gideon. Boyd Kessler stood, picked up the envelope, lowered his head, and walked out. He went straight down to the parking garage and sat in his car for a long time with the envelope resting on the steering wheel, and in that silence, only one thought moved through his mind. A man who had been stealing from the Falcone family for years had just been given a passport and a plane ticket, which meant they didn't know everything. If they knew everything, they wouldn't have been this merciful, and that meant he still had something left to sell. He didn't leave. That night, a car pulled out of the Falcone Holdings garage and headed toward the North Harbor, crossed the old iron bridge, and stopped in front of a seafood restaurant that had been closed for years, though a light still burned in the kitchen. Boyd Kessler walked inside with the leather briefcase in his hand, and the man waiting for him at the last table, his hair combed straight back and one hand slowly turning an empty glass, was Sterling Marsh. The second envelope arrived on a rainy afternoon, with no stamp and no return address. Left at the reception desk by a young delivery boy, with instructions that it be placed directly into Mr. Falcone's hands. Emmett Vaughn carried it upstairs, set it on the glass desk, and Gideon opened it. There was no letter inside, only 3 crisp photocopies of employment records, 3 job applications bearing the same name. The first was for a data entry position, stamped by the Human Resources Department, with a brief note in the corner stating that the applicant wasn't suitable. The second was for a position at the reception desk, crossed out in the same way, with the same kind of remark beside it. The third was for an administrative position on the 22nd floor, and this time it bore an acceptance stamp. The 3 applications had been submitted over the course of more than 2 seasons, which meant that, after being rejected twice, the woman had returned and applied again, continuing to knock on the same door when there were thousands of other doors in the city that would have been far easier to open. Nothing had been forged. Every document was genuine, taken from the company's own personnel archives, and that was what made Gideon sit in silence for a very long time. Because fabricated evidence could be broken apart, but the truth couldn't. He summoned her upstairs after darkness had fully settled, and the rain was striking the windows of the 40th floor in broad, slanting sheets. Adeline entered with the shoulders of her blouse still damp, and she saw her 3 applications arranged side by side on the desk, before she had time to understand why she had been called. Gideon asked her only one question. Why this building? Adeline stood straight and told him what she had meant to say from the day she saw the symbols on box number 7, but never had the chance to explain because of the fire. She said that before her mother died, she had given her one more instruction beyond the warning about the bronze box. If the day ever came when Adeline had reached the end of every road and had nowhere left to go, she was to find the building with the falcon on its roof in the harbor district and ask for any kind of work they would give her. She wasn't to ask anyone for money. She was simply to work, because someone in that building owed their family a word of thanks. Adeline said she had asked what the debt was and who owed it, but her mother had only shaken her head, as she always did. She said she submitted the first application when the 3rd hospital payment came due, the 2nd when the electricity in their apartment was cut off, and the 3rd when her younger sister needed money for a box of art supplies so she could attend drawing classes. She said she applied because she needed a job, not because she knew what was hidden inside this building. Gideon listened to everything. Then he said he had trusted her in that room, when she sat in that very chair and told him about her mother's final words. He had returned something to her that he should have kept. He had sent her down into the archive, allowed her to read page after page from a notebook that 4 men paid to decipher hadn't been able to understand, and had sat beside her in a car while she read his mother's name aloud. His voice didn't rise by so much as half a note. He said that in his life, anything that arrived at precisely the right moment had always been placed there by someone, and that a woman who knocked on the same door 3 times over the course of 2 seasons wasn't looking for work. She was looking for a way inside. Adeline didn't argue. She didn't say that if she had been working for someone, she wouldn't have run into a burning basement. She didn't say that if all she wanted was access, there would have been 100 faster ways to get it than submitting applications to human resources. She only stood there looking at the 3 forms she had written at the dining table beneath the red and white checkered cloth, rewriting them again and again until her handwriting looked neat enough, and she understood that her own persistence had become evidence against her. She asked him, "Do you believe my mother really said that to me?" Gideon didn't answer. He looked out through the window, where the rain was running down the glass in streams, and said she would be paid through the end of the month, that someone would take her home, and that beginning the next morning, she wouldn't need to return to the building. Adeline nodded once. She placed the archive inventory forms neatly along the edge of the desk, then turned and walked out. She traveled the full length of the charcoal-carpeted corridor, with her back straight and her chin raised, never stopping, never looking back, and only when the elevator doors closed in front of her did her hands begin to tremble. Gideon's phone began to vibrate while he was still standing in the same place beside the glass, with the 3 applications lying on the desk behind him, and the screen showed an unfamiliar number with an area code from the northern suburbs. He answered. The old priest's voice came through, rougher than it had been when they met, and fast, so fast that he spoke without stopping long enough for Gideon to interrupt with a single word. He said he was calling to tell him something he should have said the very day the 2 of them came to the church, that he had meant to say it, that he had stood in the doorway watching their car disappear down the gravel road, had opened his mouth, and then had remained silent. Then he said it. He said that during that winter, the person who drove the mother and child out of the city hadn't been someone Rosalind hired. It had been him. He had driven them himself through the entire night, stopping at 3 gas stations along the way, and for all these years he had believed that no one knew what he had done. He said he had been wrong. One person knew. That person came to the church several seasons later, sat in the front pew like an ordinary member of the congregation, and recited the license plate number of the car, the names of all 3 gas stations, and even the exact hour when the priest returned. The man didn't threaten him. He only said that from then on, if anyone came to the church asking about that winter, the priest was to inform him. That was all. And if he did as he was told, The mother and child would be left in peace. The priest said he had kept that agreement for an entire lifetime. That through all those seasons there had been only 3 occasions when he was forced to pick up the telephone, and the third had been the day before yesterday, just after Gideon's car disappeared down the gravel road. He said he had made the call because he still believed he was protecting them, that he had believed it for so long it had become the truth inside his own mind, and only when he heard himself speaking the names of the 2 visitors who had just left did he finally understand that he had never protected anyone. He had only been paying installments on his own fear. Gideon asked for the man's name. The old priest fell silent for a moment. Then he said there was no need to speak the name aloud, because Gideon already knew it, that the man still sat in the old seafood restaurant by the North Harbor, and that he knew about the notebook, the 2 bronze boxes, and the young woman. He had known everything since the day before yesterday. The priest continued, his voice slowing, and said that the military green iron box beneath the church was the only thing he had never mentioned during those 3 calls, that it was the one thing he had managed to preserve completely for Rosalind, and he begged Gideon not to lose it. Then he spoke his final warning. Take that girl out of the city tonight. Don't wait until morning. Gideon asked where he was. Somewhere beyond the telephone came the faint sound of something, the soft closing of a heavy wooden door. The old priest said he was where he had always been, that he was far too old to go anywhere now, and that he had spent all these years waiting for someone carrying the other half to knock on the church door, so there was nothing left for him to wait for anymore. Thank you, son. Then he ended the call. Gideon kept the phone pressed to his ear. Only the steady hum of a disconnected line remained, and he stood that way in the office on the 40th floor, listening as the silence stretched longer and longer, before calling back. The phone rang. It rang through 1 full cycle and stopped. He called a second time, then a third. No one answered again, and no one ever would. Gideon lowered the phone and walked out of the office before the screen had time to go dark. Emmett Vaughn was standing in the hallway, and one look at Gideon's face was enough for him to understand. Gideon spoke only briefly. Get the car. Go to the north side. Call for 2 more vehicles to come with them. And the military green iron box had to leave this building immediately. 4 minutes later, 3 cars pulled out of the underground garage, sped along the harbor boulevard beneath a rain that had begun to ease, and turned into the tunnel connecting the 2 shores of the bay, the shortest route to the north side. Gideon's car traveled in the middle, with Emmett sitting in the back seat and the iron box wedged securely between his legs. They had gone about 1/3 of the way through the tunnel when every light along the ceiling went out. They didn't flicker. They didn't slowly dim. They vanished all at once from one end of the tunnel to the other, and darkness flooded the concrete passage as thick as water. The headlights of the 3 cars swept across the tunnel walls, illuminating every particle of concrete dust suspended in the air. Ahead of them, roughly 110 yards away, 2 container trucks had been parked across both lanes, with no lights and no drivers in sight. The first car in the convoy slammed on its brakes, the tires gave a long shriek, and the front of the vehicle jerked sideways at an angle. The driver of Gideon's car turned his head to ask what to do, but Gideon had already unlocked the door, stepped out, walked around the hood, and pulled open the driver's side door. He told the man to move over. Gideon took the wheel and shifted into reverse. The last car in the convoy sounded its horn twice, 2 short blasts. In the rearview mirror, at the far entrance behind them, a 3rd truck was slowly moving sideways across the exit before coming to a stop. Both ends were sealed. Gideon released the clutch and began backing up slowly, the red glow of the brake lights washing over the tunnel walls, and at that exact moment, the first shot cracked from behind the containers. The windshield of the lead car shattered into a web of broken glass. Gideon's men threw open their doors and jumped out, and 2 of them immediately ran toward the front, spread across the lane, and took cover behind the vehicles, shielding the narrow space the middle car would have to cross. Emmett lowered himself onto the floor of the back seat, one arm locked around the iron box. Gideon turned the wheel as far as it would go, pressed the accelerator, and sent the car cutting diagonally across both lanes, the tires tearing across the concrete with a long scream. The side of the car scraped the tunnel wall and threw off a brief trail of sparks. He snapped the wheel back the other way and forced the vehicle into a gap narrower than its own length between the front of the first container truck and the wall. The right side mirror folded and tore away. The headlights swept through the tunnel and caught 3 figures retreating behind the cargo containers. Gideon didn't slow down. He kept his foot on the accelerator, struck a plastic barrier out of the way, and the car reared upward before crashing heavily back onto the road. Behind them, The third car in the convoy accelerated to stay close, pressing alongside Gideon's vehicle to shield it, and its side window exploded as it passed the opening. The shots continued to echo through the tunnel, striking the concrete and multiplying into a long, directionless roar. Gideon turned left, slipped past the rear of the second container truck, and the tunnel opened before him, straight, dark, and empty. He pushed the accelerator to the floor. The speedometer climbed. The headlights swallowed one painted line after another, and in the mirror he saw the third car still following, while the lead vehicle remained far behind, with both doors hanging open. Near the tunnel exit on the opposite side, the truck blocking the way began to move, trying to close the last remaining gap. Gideon studied the opening for a single heartbeat, tightened both hands around the steering wheel, and didn't reduce his speed. The car shot through. Its side ground against the truck body with a long, piercing shriek. The rear light shattered, and then they were out of the tunnel, beneath the wet night sky, with wind lashing through the broken window. He drove for nearly another mile and a quarter before pulling into an empty lot behind a row of warehouses and shutting off the engine. The car fell silent. Then he heard breathing from the back seat, short, shallow, and uneven. He turned around. Emmett Vaughn was still leaning against the door, both arms wrapped tightly around the military green iron box. His right hand was pressed over his opposite shoulder, while that arm hung uselessly at his side. He tried to lift it, and couldn't. Gideon threw open his door, came around the car, and opened the rear door. Emmett looked at him, let out one breath, and said in a voice he was trying to keep ordinary that the box was all right, that Gideon didn't need to worry. The box was all right. Gideon removed his coat and pressed it firmly against Emmett's shoulder. He made only one phone call, gave a single address, then helped the man who had stood behind his father and behind him through so many winters into the front seat, fastened the seatbelt around him, and took his place behind the wheel once more. The room was on the floor above a private clinic in the old neighborhood, a place where the doctor didn't ask for documents and didn't keep records. And by the time dawn was approaching, Emmett Vaughn had been laid on an iron bed against the wall, his shoulder wrapped in bandages and his arm suspended across his chest. Gideon pulled a chair close and sat beside him. The military green iron box rested beneath the bed. The leather-bound notebook lay on a small table by the window, and the first light of morning had begun to creep across the sill. Emmett turned his head and looked at the notebook for a long time, then said there was something he had to tell Gideon now, because if he hadn't awakened after the night before, there wouldn't be another person left in the world who knew it. He said that during that winter, when he was still young and had only just been taken into the service of the Falcone family, he had been given the kind of task newcomers were often assigned to prove that they could be trusted. They gave him a woman's name, an address in the working-class district to the west, and told him that the woman had seen something at the harbor she wasn't supposed to see. He was to find where she lived and report back. He found her. Late one night, he climbed the wooden staircase of a 3-story boarding house, counted the doors, and stopped outside the room at the end of the hallway. He stood there with his hand already resting on the doorknob. Then, through the narrow crack beneath the door, he heard someone singing. He said it was the voice of a woman soothing her child, very softly, so softly that it was probably just loud enough for the baby to hear, and it was a song he had never heard anywhere before. It wasn't played on the radio. No one in his neighborhood sang it. The melody rose, lingered through a long passage, then fell into 3 final notes, each one lower than the last, like a fading breath. He stood there and listened until the song ended. Then he took his hand from the doorknob, walked back down the stairs, and the following morning reported that the address was false, that no woman by that name lived anywhere in the district. He said he had spent the rest of his life afraid that one day someone would discover he had lied, and he had stood behind Gideon's father, then behind Gideon himself, carrying that fear inside his chest every single day. Gideon asked why he had never told him. Emmett gave a faint laugh, a short sound that made his face tighten with pain, then said that at first it had been because he was afraid, but later it wasn't fear anymore. Later, Rosalind came to him. She didn't accuse him of anything. She only said that she knew what he had done that night, and that she needed someone who could move through the streets without drawing anyone's attention. From then on, through season after season, he was the one who carried envelopes to bus stations, boarding houses, and small churches in towns that didn't appear on tourist maps. He said he never asked where she got the money, and she never told him. Then she died. Emmett fell silent for a long time. He said that when Rosalind died, there were still 3 unfinished cases in the notebook. 3 women who were still somewhere between one life and another, and he completed them himself. The first 2 weren't too difficult. He still had some savings, and his wages weren't so poor. The third was different. The third woman was in the hospital, and the final bill was greater than everything he possessed. He said he sold the house in the Eastern District, the house he had bought when he was young and had always planned to return to after he stopped working. He sold it, paid the entire bill, then rented a room near his job and told no one. Gideon sat without moving. He asked the name of the third woman. Emmett looked toward the window and said, Gideon already knew. He simply didn't want to believe it yet. It was the mother of that young woman, the daughter of the woman he had heard singing through the crack beneath the door that night. He said he had stood at the far end of the hospital corridor and watched the 2 sisters gather their belongings and leave, the older one holding the younger one's hand, and he hadn't approached them because he didn't know how to speak to someone he had both owed and repaid. Then he said he had written 1 line in the notebook. He said he didn't know how to write that old woman's script properly. He had spent night after night comparing the symbols one by one and trying to copy them as closely as he could. His hand had trembled, and the strokes hadn't come out right. But he wanted that woman's name to be there. It had to remain beside all the other names, so that if someone ever learned to read the notebook, they would know that Rosalind's work had been completed, that no one had been abandoned halfway through. Gideon Falcone bent forward, rested both elbows on his knees, and remained that way for a long time beside the iron bed in that small room, while outside the window, morning had fully arrived. After Emmett had fallen asleep, Gideon pulled the military green iron box from beneath the bed, placed it on the small table beside the window, and pried away the brown wax seal with a small knife borrowed from the nurse. Inside were the things he had expected to find: a stack of old identity papers bearing several different names, a bundle of postal money transfer receipts arranged by season, several photographs of children standing outside schools he didn't recognize, and a collection of cheap silver chains tied together with a piece of thread. He spread everything across the table. The box was empty now, but when he lifted it, the weight still felt wrong, heavier than an empty iron shell should have been. So he turned it upside down and tapped the bottom. The sound that came back was dull. The box had a false bottom. He slipped the tip of the knife into a narrow gap at one corner and gently pried upward, and a thin iron lining sprang loose, revealing a flat space just large enough to hold an envelope. The envelope was ivory-colored, unsealed, its edges yellowed with age, and on the front were only 2 handwritten words in blue-black ink, for Rosalind. Gideon recognized the handwriting immediately, the sharp, slanting script, the letters crowding one another as though the writer had always been in a hurry, the same handwriting that had signed thousands of documents Gideon had once held in his own hands. It was his father's. He sat beside the window and drew out the letter. It was only a page and a half long. The man began without any greeting. He simply wrote, "Don't be afraid. I'm not writing this to blame you." Then he wrote that he had known about what she was doing for far longer than she imagined. He wrote that he had known since the season when small discrepancies first began appearing in the South Harbor accounts, that he had ordered someone to follow her only once and never again, and that when the report came back, he had listened to every word without saying anything, then told the men to forget what they had seen. He wrote that he didn't understand why she did those things, that he was the kind of man who had never been taught how to understand, but that he knew one thing with certainty. In that house, she was the only person still capable of doing anything decent, and if he stopped her, there would be nothing decent left in it at all. He wrote that once, he had almost spoken to her about it, one evening when they were both sitting in the dining room, but in the end, he had remained silent, because if he said it aloud, she would have to answer. And once she answered, it would become something 2 people knew, and anything known by 2 people would sooner or later become something known by 3. Then Gideon reached the passage that made his hand stop upon the page. His father wrote that someone in the house had caught the scent of what she was doing, that the man hadn't dared act yet because he was still afraid of him, and that he knew very well a day would come when the man was no longer afraid. He wrote that if that day came, she mustn't send anyone after him, and that when his own turn came, he wouldn't draw his gun. He explained why in 3 brief sentences. If he fired, it would become a war. If it became a war, everyone would tear the house apart, searching for one another's weaknesses. The first thing they would uncover would be the money leaving the South Harbor accounts, and then it wouldn't be only Rosalind who was exposed, but every name she had protected in that notebook, one by one. He wrote that she had given her entire life so those people could disappear, and he couldn't be the man who caused them to be found again. He wrote that he had thought about it through many nights, and wasn't afraid, that in all his life he had never done one decent thing for anyone, so if the only decent thing he could do was remain still, then he would remain still. In the next to last sentence, he wrote, "Don't tell the boy. He's still young, and he won't understand. Let him think of me the way he always has. It will be better for him that way." Gideon read that sentence 3 times. He sat for a long while in the small room, with the steady sound of Emmett's breathing behind him, and inside his mind, the man upon whose example he had built his entire empire, the man he had always believed was the most ruthless person ever to occupy that chair, the man who had taught him that kindness was a debt, and that every debt would one day be repaid in blood, was slowly changing shape into something entirely different. Through all those winters, Gideon had believed his father had fallen because he was betrayed, because he had let his guard down, because his hand had been 1 second too slow. Now he knew that the man had known what was coming, and had chosen. Gideon lowered his eyes to the final line of the letter, the only line added in a different ink, perhaps written sometime later, and there his father had written a single sentence. "If there ever comes a day when you need to know who it was, look again at the photograph from our final family dinner. He is sitting to my right." Gideon rose. In the safe at the house on the cliff, there was only one family photograph he had never bothered to examine closely. The photograph of the long dining table surrounded by every person who had once sat there, and he didn't need to drive back to look at it, because he remembered now. The man seated to his father's right at that final dinner, his hair combed straight back and one hand slowly turning an empty glass, was Sterling Marsh. Adeline had been home for 4 days since walking out of that building, and she had already managed to submit applications to 3 other places, 2 restaurants and a warehouse in the West Side. That afternoon, her phone lit up with a video call from the summer camp number, and when she answered, June's face appeared so close to the camera that her nose nearly filled the screen, with a streak of green paint smeared across it. The little girl stepped back and lifted a painting almost as large as she was, with 2 friends standing on either side to help hold the edges of the paper. In the picture was a lake painted in 3 different shades of blue, several wooden cabins with red roofs, and in the lower right corner, 2 figures holding hands, one tall and one small. June said the teacher had told her the painting would be hung in the center of the exhibition room instead of in a corner, that the tall person was Adeline and the smaller one was her, and that she had painted her sister's hair reddish-brown, because the paint box at camp had a reddish-brown color that they didn't have at home. Adeline asked what they were having for dinner, and June recited a long list before bursting into laughter, when someone behind her shouted into the phone that there would be apple pie too. The little girl pressed her face close to the camera again, and reminded her sister to stand in the very front row, and Adeline told her that once a promise had been sealed, it couldn't be taken back. The call ended. She sat looking at the black screen for a while longer, then went downstairs to collect the mail. There was a large envelope in the mailbox with no stamp, and inside was a thick stack of papers. The first page was a copy of her mother's hospital admission form. The second was an itemized statement of treatment costs, line after line, charge after charge, numbers Adeline had memorized so completely that she didn't need to read them to know where each one appeared. The third page was a notice transferring the remaining debt to a financial collection company with an address in the North Harbor district, and at the very bottom was a brief, handwritten note saying that the entire balance could be erased that evening, that the person who signed it would be waiting at the old seafood restaurant on the Harbor Road, and that if she brought anyone with her, the meeting wouldn't take place. Adeline read the note 3 times. She thought about calling Emmett Vaughn, then remembered that she didn't have his number. She thought about the building with the falcon on its roof, and about the man who had told her she no longer needed to return there. She thought about her 3 applications spread across the glass desk. Then she folded the papers, placed them in her handbag, put on her coat, and left for the train station. On the way, her phone vibrated with a message from an unfamiliar number. There was no greeting and no signature, only a download link and a single sentence saying, "You'll need this more than I will." She opened it while the train was crossing the iron bridge. It was a file more than 200 pages long, and even to someone who had never studied accounting, it was clear what she was looking at. There were cargo statements, listing ship names and container numbers, streams of money passing through 4 companies before returning to a single account, photographs of documents bearing genuine signatures, and throughout the entire file, One name appeared again and again: Sterling Marsh. At the end was a final page unlike everything before it. Only a photograph of a handwritten note in hurried, slanting script, saying that whoever read this should give it to someone who knew how to use it, that I took the envelope they gave me, and I didn't leave, that I should have left. Adeline didn't know who had written it. She only sat on the train with the phone burning hot in her hand, and she saved the entire file in 3 different places before the train reached the final station. That night, in the North Harbor district, a Falcone Holdings car was found parked in an empty lot behind a row of cold storage warehouses. Its doors unlocked, the key still in the ignition, and the leather briefcase on the back seat torn apart and completely empty, while the man who had driven it there was never seen again. People said Sterling Marsh hadn't killed Boyd Kessler because he had betrayed the Falcone family, because Sterling could still make use of a traitor. They said he killed Boyd because when he searched the computer inside the briefcase, everything on it had already been sent away. Adeline stepped off the train and walked along the harbor road beneath the dull yellow glare of the high lamps, the sea wind striking her face with the smell of engine oil and fish. The old seafood restaurant stood at the end of the road, its sign long since gone dark, though a light was still burning in the kitchen, casting a yellow strip through the clouded window. She stopped at the door, adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and inside her coat pocket, the little bronze box rested silently. Then she pushed the door open and stepped inside. There was no one inside the restaurant except a man polishing glasses behind the counter, and without looking up, he said that the owner hadn't arrived yet, and she could sit at any table she liked while she waited. Adeline hadn't even had time to pull out a chair when the door behind her flew open, and the sea wind rushed in with 3 men. Gideon Falcone was the first through the door. He didn't look around the room or say anything to the man behind the counter. He walked straight toward her, and this time his voice no longer carried the calm, even restraint he always maintained. He told her to get into the car immediately. He said he had gone to her apartment, questioned the neighbor, and sent men to trace every train she might have taken. He asked whether she had any idea what kind of place this restaurant was, whether she knew who had summoned her there. Adeline asked why he had gone looking for her. Gideon didn't answer that question. He said she was staying out of this, that none of it concerned her, that she would take the money they offered and get her sister out of the city for a few weeks. Adeline placed her handbag on the table. She took out the brown leather-bound notebook she had carried with her since that afternoon, set it in front of him, and said, "Then before I leave, explain to me whose concern this is." She opened it, ran her finger along the rows of symbols she could now read as quickly as ordinary print, and began reading aloud. A name, a season, a sum of money, an address, then the next name, then another. She read more than 20 names before stopping, and she said that all these people were still alive, that some of them had grandchildren now, that the notebook recorded that a child had started school, that those women had changed their names, moved away, and rebuilt entire lives with nothing but their own 2 hands, and that all of it remained standing, only because no one knew who they were. She said that the man sitting somewhere in this city already knew the notebook existed, and that if even one name inside it was exposed, someone would knock on the door of a house where one of those women now lived. On some quiet evening when she believed the past had finally stopped looking for her, Gideon said his people would handle it. Adeline said his people couldn't read the notebook. She said she was the only person who could read it, that if she got into the car and left, the notebook would remain nothing more than a stack of meaningless symbols to everyone, including him, and the fund would die for a second time, except this time it would be gone forever. The restaurant fell silent. At some point, the man behind the counter had put down the glass and disappeared into the kitchen. Gideon looked at the notebook, then at her, and said he had thrown her out of that building 4 days ago. Adeline nodded and said, "Yes, you did." Then she continued in a perfectly calm voice, saying that the reason she was standing there that night had nothing to do with him. She said his mother had sat in a basement with her grandmother during that winter, when her grandmother was no one, when she had no money, no papers, and no person in the world who knew whether she was alive or dead. His mother hadn't known her grandmother. She hadn't owed her anything. No one had ever thanked her. She had done it anyway. Then Adeline pushed the notebook into the center of the table, placed her hand over it, and said, "Now it's my turn." The man behind the counter didn't return, but the telephone in the kitchen rang exactly once and fell silent, and 3 minutes later, one of Gideon's men reported that Sterling Marsh's car had just left the restaurant district and was heading east, toward Container Yard Number 4 at the Old Harbor. Gideon rose. He told 2 men to take Adeline to the car and remain with her, and he gave her only one instruction, that the notebook had to leave the harbor before he did. Then he walked out. Container yard number 4 lay along the eastern edge of the old harbor, a paved expanse, as wide as several football fields, bordered on both sides by rows of steel containers stacked 3 levels high into long parallel walls, creating a network of narrow, dark passages like city streets. Gideon hadn't set foot there since the night he had been summoned to identify his father. He drove through the side gate, turned off the headlights and the engine, then stepped out while the 2 cars carrying his men were still about 4 minutes away. He didn't wait. He walked between 2 rows of steel containers, running his left hand along the metal wall to count each turn. And at the second intersection, he heard shoes grinding against the gravel behind him. He spun around and lowered his shoulder just as a shadow lunged from the narrow opening on his right. They collided. Both men slammed into the steel wall, and the impact echoed down the entire row. Gideon blocked the arm swinging toward him, trapped it beneath his own, turned his hips, and tore the man away from the container before throwing him face down onto the pavement. He didn't stop. He ran toward the light, turned left, then right. The headlights of a forklift flared to life at the far end of the passage and swept directly across his face, and Gideon rolled into the gap between 2 steel containers just as the beam passed over him. The first shot cracked through the yard, struck the walls of steel, then doubled and tripled in the echoes circling the entire maze until there was no way to tell where it had come from. Gideon climbed onto the top of a container, on the lowest level using the iron rungs welded to its side, and pressed himself flat. From there, he looked down into the maze below and saw 3 flashlight beams moving in 3 different directions. At the far end of the yard, beneath the only high-pressure lamp still burning, a car waited with its engine running and its rear door open. He ran along the tops of the containers, crossing from one steel box to the next, every step landing with a heavy thud against the metal, until one of the flashlight beams tilted upward and found him. Gideon jumped onto the roof of the neighboring row, 1 level lower, landed on his shoulder, rolled once, then climbed down into the passage using another iron ladder and kept running. At the final turn, 2 men blocked his path. The first swung a length of steel pipe. Instead of retreating beyond its reach, Gideon stepped inside the arc, stopped the man's elbow with his forearm, and drove his own elbow upward. The pipe struck the pavement with a sharp metallic clang. The second man rushed him from the left, and Gideon used the first as a shield, shoving him into his partner, then moved around behind them both, and continued running without looking back. Behind him, the horns of 2 Falcone vehicles sounded at the main gate, their headlights sweeping across the yard, and the men scattered throughout the steel maze began retreating toward the waiting car. Gideon cut diagonally across 2 rows of containers, vaulted over a stack of wooden pallets, and reached the open ground beneath the high lamp just as the last man slammed the rear door of the vehicle shut. He didn't aim at the car. He aimed at the front left tire. The vehicle surged forward for roughly 65 feet before veering sharply to one side, sliding across the wet pavement, and crashing at an angle into the base of a container stack, crushing its front end. The driver's door flew open. A man with his hair combed straight back crawled out, pushed himself upright, and began running toward the fence at the edge of the yard. Gideon went after him. The distance narrowed from 65 feet to 30, then 15. At the foot of the barbed wire fence, the other man spun around and swung his arm. Gideon knocked it aside, locked the wrist, turned his body, and forced Sterling Marsh face down onto the cold pavement, one arm twisted behind his back beneath the knee of the man whose family dinner table he had once shared so many winters ago. The headlights of the 2 arriving cars swept over them, flooding the entire stretch of ground with light, while the sound of running footsteps drew closer with every second. Gideon's men stopped in a curved line several steps away, and no one moved any closer because no one had been given the order. Gideon loosened his hold, pulled Sterling Marsh upright, and sat him against the base of the fence. Sterling remained there, gasping for breath. One cheek scraped raw from the pavement, his carefully combed hair fallen loose across his forehead. He looked up and laughed, a short, broken sound, then said that Gideon's father had stood in exactly the same way, right there in that yard, not very far from where they were now. Gideon didn't answer. Sterling wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and continued, saying that Gideon had found his mother's ledger, hadn't he? And that he thought this meant everything was over. He said Rosalind had been so careful that no one could read her writing, but there was one place where she hadn't been careful enough. She had trusted the messenger. Those envelopes had passed through countless bus stations and boarding houses, and in every one of those places, there had been someone on Sterling's payroll who wrote down a single line, which name, where she went, and on what day. Over the course of many seasons, those scattered lines had become a second ledger, one written in ordinary words that anyone could understand. He said it wasn't on him, it wasn't in his house, and it wasn't hidden anywhere Gideon's men could find that night. Someone far away was keeping it, and once every month, that person received a telephone call. If a month passed without the call, then the person knew exactly what to do. Then Sterling looked up and spoke his final warning. So if I don't go home tonight, by tomorrow morning, every one of the 100 names in your mother's ledger will be sitting on the desks of the people those women ran away from. No one in the curved line said a word. Gideon rose to his full height. He looked down at the man sitting beneath the fence. The man who had once sat to his father's right at his family's dinner table. The man who had sat in the front pew of a suburban church and recited 3 gas stations and a license plate number to an old priest. The man who had taken Boyd Kessler's leather briefcase from the empty lot behind the cold storage warehouses. Gideon stood that way for a long time. Wind swept in from the bay, moving through the rows of steel containers and creating a low, unbroken hum. There were no voices inside his mind, only an ivory sheet of paper covered in hurried, slanting handwriting, and one brief passage saying that if his father fired his gun, it would become a war, and in a war, people tore everything apart searching for one another's weaknesses, and the first things uncovered would be the names. All his life, Gideon Falcone had believed his father remained still because he was afraid. He had built an entire empire upon the belief that the strong man was the one who struck first, that kindness was a debt, and that every debt would someday be collected. Now, standing on the very ground where that man had fallen, Gideon understood that remaining still had been the hardest thing a man like his father had ever done, and that he hadn't done it for himself. Gideon understood something else as well. If he dealt with Sterling Marsh that night, in the way the entire city expected him to, then by morning, there would be women in nameless towns packing their belongings into bags for the second time in their lives. Children would have to change schools. Names that had remained buried and safe for years would suddenly reappear on the desks of men who were still searching for them. His mother had given her entire life so those names could disappear. Gideon lowered his hand. He turned to the man standing closest to him and said to call the lawyers, then to call Inspector Whitfield's team at the Harbor Authority and tell them to bring someone who could take an official statement. The man froze for the space of a single heartbeat before drawing out his phone. Gideon removed his coat and threw it onto the pavement beside Sterling, then sent Adeline a single message, telling her to forward the entire file she had received that night to the mailbox address his lawyer would read to her. Sterling Marsh watched every movement, and the smile slowly vanished from his face, because he understood that the only thing he had prepared himself to face was a bullet, and the man standing before him had just decided not to fire. The trial lasted through the end of autumn, and the file a man had sent away on the final night of his life became the thing that ensured Sterling Marsh would never rise again. In the months that followed, the Falcone family withdrew from 3 lines of business that had sustained it through countless winters, and the price was nearly half of the people who had once served under Gideon quietly walking away with a sum so large that the new accountant had to read the final statement twice. Gideon explained nothing to anyone. He simply signed each document in turn and kept the harbor along with the legitimate transportation contracts. By spring, the foundation had been formally registered under Rosalind's name, and its opening ceremony was held in the yard of the stone church in the northern suburbs, where rows of folding chairs had been arranged across the grass, and a white canopy stretched overhead in case it rained. Gideon had offered Adeline a sum of money, calling it what his mother still owed her family, and she refused before he had finished the first sentence, saying that if Rosalind were still alive, she wouldn't have given money to anyone in that way either. Adeline accepted the position of running the foundation, with a contract and a salary clearly written on paper, and the only condition she set was that every record belonging to the people they helped would remain in her care and be encoded in the manner her mother had taught her. That morning, they arrived long before the appointed time, but when the car stopped, someone was already waiting in the churchyard. The first woman was around 70, wearing a blue sweater and carrying a cloth bag in one hand. She didn't ask who anyone was. She walked directly to Adeline and spoke a name, her old name, the one she hadn't used in many years, then said she had 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren, and that the oldest was now in her 3rd year of nursing school. She recited each of their names slowly, one by one, as though speaking those names aloud before another person was something she had waited her entire life to do. Then she stepped aside. The second woman came forward, then the third. Some arrived with their daughters. Some leaned on canes. Some carried photographs in their wallets and held them up for everyone to see. Each woman began with her old name, then spoke the names of all those who had been born afterward. Adeline listened to every one of them, holding the leather-bound notebook in her hands without opening it once, because every name inside it was now standing before her and speaking for itself. Gideon remained several steps behind her and said nothing for nearly an hour, and at one point, he had to turn his face away and look toward the row of elm trees. By noon, the children from the attending families had begun running around the churchyard, while June had been busy since early morning with what she considered the most important task of all. She had brought the painting she made at summer camp, but the one displayed that day was a new picture, drawn on the largest sheet of paper she had been able to ask for. In the picture, 3 people stood beside one another on the grass, one tall, one of medium height, and one the smallest of all. Above them floated an enormous white cloud, and sitting on that cloud was a fairy in a blue dress, her hair gathered into a high bun, holding a small golden box in one hand. June asked 2 people carrying chairs to help her hang the picture on the wooden board at the front of the yard, stepped back to study it, adjusted it until it was straight, then turned, tugged at Adeline's sleeve, and asked, "Is the fairy real, Addie?" Adeline opened her mouth, but she couldn't find an answer. Gideon was the one who stepped forward. He lowered himself until he was at the little girl's eye level and said, "Yes, she was real. She was here long before any of us." June nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose belief had merely been confirmed, then ran off to find her friends. The ceremony began shortly afterward. It was brief, with no long speeches. At the far end of the yard stood a small glass case, and inside it, upon a piece of wine-colored velvet, the 2 bronze boxes rested side by side. Adeline opened the case. Gideon turned the key of the first box until the spring was fully wound, and she wound the second. Then together, they opened both lids. The melody rose through the crowded churchyard, the first half flowing into the second, passing through the long, lingering phrase, before descending into the final 3 notes. The crowd fell completely silent. The woman in the blue sweater lifted one hand to cover her mouth, and in the third row, another elderly woman began singing softly along with the music, in perfect time, following every note, because her own mother had once sung that same song to her. After the ceremony had ended, and the rows of folding chairs had been put away, June was the one who came up with the idea of taking a picture. She said they had to have one to hang in the kitchen beside the Mercer restaurant menu, and so the 3 of them walked toward the gate. Adeline carried the torn half of the old photograph with her, raised it to eye level, stepped back several paces, then moved forward again, searching for the exact place where the photographer had stood all those years ago. At last, she set her phone on top of the stone pillar across the walkway and started the timer. The 3 of them took their places in the center of the frame, standing on the stone steps worn hollow in the middle. June stood in front, with both hands clasped behind her back, smiling so widely that her eyes squeezed shut. Adeline stood to the little girl's left, with one hand resting on her shoulder. Gideon stood to the right, half a step behind them, and because he didn't know what to do with his hands, he finally let them hang at his sides. The afternoon sunlight fell at an angle through the branches of the elm tree and rested upon the 3 of them. The timer counted down. Not one of them looked behind them. Later, 2 copies of that photograph were printed. One was hung in the small kitchen on the north side. The other was placed inside the glass case in the churchyard, beside the torn half of the old photograph, yellowed with age and cracked at all 4 corners, so that anyone passing by could look at both pictures at once and understand for themselves the distance between them. Some questions take life many years to answer. A woman had once saved every coin she could to rescue herself, then stood before the open door to freedom and turned away, using everything she had gathered to purchase an escape for strangers she would never see again. She received no word of thanks while she was alive. No one knew her name, and she carried every secret with her into the grave. But a seed planted in silence never truly dies. It only rests beneath the soil, passing through one lifetime and then another, until someone touches it by chance and it blossoms into a season of flowers greater than even the person who planted it could ever have imagined. And there is one more truth this story leaves behind. No one born in darkness is required to belong to the darkness, because in the end, What decides who we are isn't where we were born or what our parents did. It is what we choose to do when no one is forcing us to make that choice. Inside the glass case in the churchyard, beneath the final light of the day, the two bronze boxes still rested beside each other on the wine-colored velvet, and the bronze disc inside continued turning slowly for one final circle, very softly, before coming to a complete stop. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so that each day we may have another beautiful story to listen to together. How do you feel about Gideon and Adeline's journey? And what part of today's story will remain with you the longest? Please leave a comment below, because we truly hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with good health, a joyful life, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.